Gotcha. Yeah.
Hi, this is Paul. I have something a little different today. Well, not totally different. Eamon and Catherine are a couple that's on. James Kim has been following my channel for a while. He and I have had email conversations back and forth, and he's been watching the marriage crisis conversation. And he said, "Oh, you should talk to my wife." And I said, "Well, why don't the both of you come on and we'll talk." So why don't you guys introduce yourselves?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll preface this by saying that I might be doing more of the talking at my wife's insistence. Just
Oh,
she's newer to this space,
okay.
the Jordan Peterson, all this part of the internet, and perhaps of the internet in general. But yeah, how I first got introduced to you, Paul, and I'm sure this is the first time that you've heard this, is through the biblical lectures, and your comment through them. I first got introduced to Peterson probably like in 2017, right as he was starting to get really popular and right into that space. I think I remember his subscriber count on YouTube was like 60,000, 50,000.
Wow, that's very early then.
Yeah, and I was early enough and lucky enough to get in while he had that Patreon um, uh, level where you could have a one-on-one conversation with him.
Yeah, yeah.
So I had that conversation with him in 2000. It got delayed because he was getting pretty busy.
Yeah.
So I remember his wife Tammy was emailing me and telling me perpetually, like, pushing it back for like a year, really.
Wow.
And yeah, so I spoke with him, and that's right around the time that he started his lectures, which is when you started to comment on them. And I was really intrigued by that content, especially. Of course, all the stuff, the maps of meaning, all those things I was listening to. Um, but once you got into the biblical lectures, um, that's really when it piqued my interest, because, and perhaps we'll talk about our backstory and how we grew up, but I'd always grown up in the church, and heard countless sermons. Can't remember any of them, but but when he started talking about the Bible from a psychological lens, from sort of a ground up explanation, rather than a top down explanation, that was so revolutionary for me. And I'd never heard the Bible talked about in this way, to the point where you started getting a little suspicious, right? Like, and perhaps you've encountered this too from your peers in ministry, but like, is he really talking the truth about this, right? But what really confirmed it for me, I would say, is that I kind of gone through my own deconstruction period with Christianity, where I was kind of just done with the church after college, and I was rebuilding my life back up from the ground up, honestly, just starting with, okay, what's important to me? And I'll go into the specifics later, but I felt like that was also mimicking, in a way, how God wants us to search for him, like in the small things, right? In the day-to-day, rather than these grand signs or miracles, or these things, from whispers rather than a loud voice, right? And I felt like I was doing that during my 20s. And so when I talked with Peterson in 2000, I think it was 2018, I finally spoke with him. That was sort of the tail end of the rebuilding my life process. So it didn't kickstart it, but what it did was he gave me a vocabulary with which I was able to understand what I was doing during my 20s. Something that, a message that I really wasn't receiving from the church, or from the family, or from my friends. Of course, you hear countless times, when you're lost, like, just pray,
Yeah.
Go to church, do all these
Yeah.
things. And I was doing that to some degree, but again, my faith, whatever that was, that had built up from Sunday school to youth group or through college to just wasn't, I just felt like it wasn't relevant. It just wasn't applicable to this stage in life. So yeah, so that's how I found you. And of course, when you started these, and I met my wife in 2019, and
We met earlier than
Oh,
2000.
we got married in 2019.
okay.
Well, it's interesting because actually, to go back, we were long distance for 2 years. So I had met her in 2017, right when I felt like I was ready to get married. Because prior to that, I was not ready to get married. I was not interested in relationships at all. I had dated in college, but right in my early 20s, after college graduation, yeah, I was just done with relationships. I was like, maybe I need to back up and talk a little bit more about my our how I was brought up, and how Isabel was brought up, because I think that also ties into our faith, Korean American culture, and all those things. But is there anything else, anything you want to say right now?
Oh no, you
No.
can go on with your intro.
Okay. So I'll give a little bit of a backstory in terms of how I was raised. I know that from listening to enough of your talks, that's how a lot of people.
Yep. Helps people contextualize the story.
Yes. I'll say that, I'll talk a lot about being Korean American and growing up Korean American, but I don't, I just want to put it out there that I don't speak for all, Korean Americans or anything like that. That being said, there's a lot of commonalities between us. And so it's a classic story of my parents immigrated to the States in the early 80s. They grew up in the countryside of Korea, which we Koreans call the Shigor. Every Korean knows that term. Really, anything outside of Seoul is the countryside. So they grew up outside of Seoul on the west coast of Korea. They grew up in neighboring villages, so they knew each other ever since from when they were little kids. And there were some things that were happening in my mom's family that necessitated them to move to Portland, to Oregon, which is where we grew up and where we, where home base is for us. I was born in '86, and growing up, they put a lot of, perhaps too much, focus on making sure that we had all the opportunities that they didn't have, because neither of my parents graduated from college. My dad attended some college in Korea, but due to financial circumstances and family circumstances, he was never able to finish. And my mom, I believe, graduated high school, but post-secondary education was really not an option for her, because her mom actually passed away when she was a teenager. And so her job was really raising her, helping to raise, or kind of being the glue of her 6 brothers and 1 sister. So that large family. Most of the brothers and her moved to the States, and my dad, while he was serving in the mandatory military service, after finishing that, they got married in Korea, moved to the States. So they came without much education, without much, fluency in the language, without a lot of community, although they did have a big family. All the brothers were there. And so I grew up with a lot of cousins in this area. But I think they had a really big chip on the shoulder. My dad, especially, regarding education. He always felt, because he was book smart. Like, it's one thing when your dad says, yeah, I was the smartest kid in class, but when your uncles also confirmed that, they grew up around him, like, he was that kid that was just type A, studied till he slept, woke up, studied, and just never really had that opportunity to take that next step. And with that chip on his shoulder, it got transferred to my younger brother and I. And so the stereotype, you know, that you've seen those, perhaps those memes of the Asian dads and like, why is your blood type B? Why is it not A? You know, like those kinds of yeah, yeah. That was it. It's funny, but it hurts because it's so true in my
Wow.
like perfection in that sense was just assumed. It was like, look, I understood very early on that, look, your life isn't hard. Like him to me, like try living my life right now, trying to earn a living, raising a family in a foreign country, right? Your life isn't hard. You're privileged.
Yeah.
And so every opportunity, I learned so many instruments growing up, because probably I think from my mom's, like she always wanted to be music. She has an artistic side to her. And of course in school, like, we had to study all the time. And, luckily for me, and I know I'm talking a lot, I'll have Isabel start talking too, but lucky for me, like I was good at school. Like I understood it. In a lot of ways, the rules for school were a lot more understandable than the rules at home, because you study for this test, you write the paper, you get a grade that tells you how well you did, and you move on. At home, it sort of felt like nothing was ever good enough. So as much as I would perform, and my peers or teachers would be impressed with my performance, I always felt like, well, I wasn't hearing that at home. Maybe a little bit. I don't want to paint my parents as total tyrants. Like, they're very loving and very caring in the way that they knew how to be. But in terms of performance, I always felt like, not good enough, could always do better. No time to stay still, to rest. Got to keep moving, right? Gotta reach for that next step. And I'll talk about church separately from this, but we're in church a lot, mostly, and that's where I really feel like home base is too, in terms of familiarity and the people that I know and the people that I grew up with. I didn't really feel as much connection with my school friends, because honestly, I didn't really want to necessarily be in school. I was good at it, but I didn't really.
You were in public school?
Yeah, public school.
Okay.
Didn't really have the resources to, go to private school. So long story short, the sum of my high school years is, it turns out if you do well in school and you have all these activities under your belt, you develop pretty good application for college.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I ended up going to the Holy Grail, or the group for Asians, which I went to an Ivy League school, which was simultaneously maybe the best thing that I did for me personally, but maybe the worst thing too, because it completely justified, in my parents' eyes, all the ways that they raised me.
It worked.
Yeah. Looking back on it now, it was as much their accomplishment as it was mine, and I have no problem with sharing that, honestly. They worked hard, and now that I've lived as much of my life outside of college than before, like I completely understand why they put so much emphasis on education, because for them that was their way out. I'm in the rural South, or South Korea. Education was the only way out. You go to Seoul, you try to get into Seoul National University or some of these other the top schools, and that's your way into financial success and all of that. So I understood that. And then I've talked enough, but you want to talk about
just a little
just a little how you.
Oh, hang on a second. Someone's yelling for me. Hang on. This is what happens. Just
okay.
All right. Sorry for the interruption. Go ahead.
Oh, no worries. Hi, Paul. It's very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
I would often hear your voice.
Yeah.
James often plays your videos, and I think yeah, I've overheard just a little bit, and it's a little more complex for my brain to understand. Well, but it's really, yeah, cool to have this time with you. So a little bit about my upbringing. I will say that so I was born in Chicago, Illinois, so I'm from the Midwest originally, and I can't tell my story or without saying this part of my story, which is that my parents they divorced when I was only a baby, so like
Oh,
just
wow.
like a year and a half or 2 years old was when my parents had divorced. And I would say that that is a big part of my story because I grew up living with my dad until I was 10 years old, and circumstances just kind of made it be that way. And then so life living with dad until 10, and then after that moving to live with my mom from 11 and on, or 10 and onwards. It's just like it's such a different world. And so um yeah, that is a part of my story and what informed which is the path that I took as
Mhm.
well. And I know that James introduced me as a mental health counselor,
Yeah.
but it was, yeah, it was just knowing what some of the hardship was
Yeah.
in experiencing what I did that made me want to learn more about myself
Yeah.
and why I thought the way I did, had certain struggles, or and it was really good. I think it also matched my personality in that, like, I love learning, I love understanding things, I love not only my story but also the stories of others.
Mhm.
And so yeah, those are some of the influences of how and why I became a counselor.
Okay.
And just to give a little bit background to on church. So before I lived with my mom, I didn't really go to church. I didn't know God. And then my mom was the first one in her family to meet Jesus, and
Mhm.
that was through a hard circumstance of her own. But it seems like
Mm.
sometimes when you're in the lowest places, like
Yeah.
God really wants to meet you. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, my mom was the first one to believe, and through her faith, my stepdad. So she, by the time I had moved to live with my mom, she had remarried, and so all of a sudden, I had two brothers and a dad, like a stepdad, and so that was when also began going to church. And I think that changed my life. I mean, and not I think, I know it did. I enjoyed going to church with my mom, or my family.
Yeah.
And I think that's where just parts of my heart, like what I was longing for, were
Mhm.
slowly being filled.
Mhm.
And so since then, my faith grew gradually.
Mhm.
A really solidifying point in my life was when in college. So it was in college where it wasn't a straight path. So what happened was I went to university in Tacoma thinking that I wanted to go into the medical route. Uh, as most Asians, you think that you got
Like a good age.
yeah, yeah, to go get their pre-med requirement, go into the pre-med program no matter what. But I did want to do that with the hopes of using those skills to go out into the world maybe and offering a practical um, healing in addition to the gospel.
Mhm.
But God had different plans for me. And I had been in that program for a year and a half, but around then was when a group of us at that university decided to go on a road trip to Kansas City, known as IHOP, International House of Prayer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you're familiar with that.
Yep.
Um, and that's where I just really felt like God was stopping me in my tracks and was like trying to get my attention. And he did get my attention, but I still wasn't sure what that meant or what I was supposed to do. And so, long story short, I ended up transferring to a Bible college, and it wasn't with the intention of like becoming a pastor or doing something in the church necessarily, but just wanting to learn who God was and learning how to understand His Word in a deeper way. And so that's what changed the trajectory of my life in a way. And that was wonderful. Those years were great. And yeah, and that's kind of how I actually took some of my first counseling classes in Bible college, not even knowing that was something I was going to be doing. But again, God knew. And
Yeah.
somehow I chose those classes,
Yeah.
and tried some different jobs along the way, but just came back to counseling. And that's where I am right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did the church that you grew up in, was that a Korean church? Was it a evangelical church? What kind of a church was it?
I grew up in a Korean church,
Oh,
so
okay.
Korean American, in that like there was a youth ministry where the leaders did speak English.
Okay. Okay.
That was easier for us too.
Yeah.
And I grew up in a predominantly Presbyterian
Yeah.
church.
Okay.
Uh,
Even though you went to IHOP, huh?
Exactly. But see, both, it's interesting because IHOP and the Bible college I went to, I would say they incorporate the Holy Spirit's
Yeah. Yeah.
work a lot, and so I was able to get both of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I am in my work life, I am in the Christian Reformed Church what is known as a synodical deputy, which means that I have to visit other classes to just make sure that certain procedural orders are followed. And here in California, two of the classes, really two of the classes down south in Southern California are Korean classes, and so I do wind up going and working in amongst Korean pastors and Korean churches, and I know that the language is a big deal. Both of you were born in America, so what was it like growing up in church in the Korean language? I mean, because the culture's thick, but then you've also got the language.
Yeah. Well, for me, like all my life, all I knew known growing up, so it's interesting. It's hard for me to separate being Korean and going to church. The two were like, to this day, when I see an older Korean, I immediately think, where is he a deacon?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
or is he an elder at a church? And it's so intertwined in my life that all these older people that I'd grown up with, the parents of my friends, were all just so intimately involved in the church that it was hard to separate where does Korean culture end and being Korean Christian, where does that start?
Yeah.
So for me, in terms of asked about the language, yeah, I think there was a clear division between, of course, like the first generation Korean Americans, like my parents and that generation, and then of course us, second generation, who I mean, I can understand it. I can understand it more than I can speak it, just because, like, I mean, I certainly went to Korean school growing up, but once my family realized, well, in school they speak English, so you're speaking, that's
Yeah.
where the focus is going to be. Yeah, I never. It was, yeah, I felt like, I don't want to say separate, but I always knew that we were this distinct group, the second generation Korean Americans, that were just a part of the greater church, the greater Korean church, but perhaps not like fully integrated into it. And I think that persists today a little bit. And I know you've talked a little bit about the EM, how Korean churches have the English ministry, and then they have the large KM, and how the EM, I've seen it in the church that we go to, which is the same church that I've grown up pretty much in all my life, which is that the EM is sort of like this, like outpost, like don't quite know where it fits in and how it fits in. It certainly helps to have a pastor that's in place that can speak both languages, so who has a foot in both worlds. But it's sort of like a catch-all group of second generation, maybe 1.5, maybe third generation, people who have moved here from out of state and are just looking for a, so it's sort of yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, the with churches trying to reconcile the English speaking congregation and then the larger KM. Or what about whoever?
Yeah, I think when I was younger, I didn't notice the distinction as much, and maybe that was because we were much more, well, I grew up in a very small church, so it was like they were just starting a church. Unfortunately, as you know too, Paul, church splits are pretty common. And so what ended up happening, or was a big part of my childhood, was that the church had split. So that's where like my story comes in with my church experience. But the church had split, and then there was this new pastor, and he was starting a church somewhere, and that's where, and there was just a small group of like maybe 5 or 6 families or something. So we were such a tight-knit group, and those were my most memorable church years because there wasn't that division. I think I loved like sitting next to my mom and listen, and because I did grow up speaking Korean, my parents really made sure that we knew and spoke the language at home. So like sometimes my mom would be like, can you start speaking in English so I can start to learn the language?
Oh,
None of like my brothers and I would be like, we just can't anymore. Like we can't. We're like so used to speaking in Korean with you. Yeah.
Yep.
So going to a Korean church where, the pastor would speak or preach in Korean, I'd say I understood like 70% of it, but it was enough where it still really touched my heart.
Okay.
And I went to like Friday night praise night. So as you may be aware too, you go to church several times a week, not just.
Yes.
And Friday nights, Paul, like I loved going to Friday night praise nights and singing and praising in Korean. There was just a different level of connection. Maybe I don't know what it was, but it was really good. Yeah. And then I'd say that, so I couldn't really notice the effect of language and my church experience when I was younger, but I feel that a lot more now. So like as I grew older, like that's where I guess kind of see that, like what James was describing about the EM and then the KM, that kind of dynamic. But I wasn't so aware of that when growing up because it was a smaller setting and we were all like family, and I miss that. Yeah.
No, small churches small churches at their best are like that. They really are. They are like family, and especially if there's also sort of a special way in which the group is distinct, like an ethnicity or a language thing, it can be really powerful. And the whole language thing, growing up, I've told the story before. One of my neighbors was from Puerto Rico. He had married a woman from New Jersey, actually, and he wanted his children to know Spanish. So when his children were young, before they went to school, he would always mostly just speak Spanish to his kids. And of course, they moved next door, and they had a sweet little girl. She was just a little 4-year-old. Of course, my wife and I knew Spanish, and so when she'd come over, I'd try speaking Spanish to her. She'd just glare at me like, you're not supposed to speak that language. That language is for me and Dad. So those bonds are really tight and really strong. It's interesting how, James, you, it sounds like, by the time you sort of got through and got out, you were ready to leave the church behind. And Isabel, for you, church was, this was a really important part of your life. You didn't want to leave that behind.
Yeah, well, the leaving behind, I actually really liked church, and I volunteered a lot of my time in the church. Like Isabel was saying, you don't go to church just once, right? There's Sunday, there's the Wednesday. I remember growing up, there's the midweek Wednesday service. And then when you grow up, it's the Friday youth group service. On Saturday was the Korean school that we would go to at the church. And so I was at church all the time. And in high school, I actually served on the praise team, leading praise. But and also through college too. But the reason why church, I sort of fell away from the church was because right in the middle of college. So I like Isabel, I went in thinking, all right, well, I'm just going to do pre-med. It's what my parents always wanted me to do. So I'm just going to keep doing that. Halfway through, I realized I did not want to do this I needed to kind of break out into my own.
Yeah.
And through a series of events, I ended up becoming a philosophy major.
Oh boy.
So I went from taking a lot of science classes to, that first philosophy class actually was really life-changing for me, because for the first time I was being taught how to think and how to write. And that professor, to this day, I honor him. He passed away, unfortunately, not too long after I graduated. He taught at my school for 50 years. He's a great teacher, just so curious about how we thought, and just awesome. So my whole life plan, at least in terms of how my parents had foreseen it, was that I was just going to go to this college, the same college that my uncle went to, and he's a doctor. So he was like, all right, well, this is all going according to plan. But that plan stopped when I realized I couldn't do this. Like it just was not how I wanted to live the rest of my life. And when you're a philosophy major, like a lot of my peers were preparing to go to law school. So I was like, oh, okay, all right, well, let's pick that path. Maybe that'll make my parents proud instead.
Doctor, lawyer,
exactly.
engineer.
Yeah, exactly. Now, see, all the stereotypes ring true, Paul. Like, and I, after graduating,
it's not just Koreans.
It's true. It's very true. Once I graduated, I thought, okay, well, if I want to go to law school, like, you might as well figure out, like, work in a law firm first and see, like, is this what you want to do, right? And so I got a job in DC, Washington, DC, as a paralegal. And the first day I realized I did not want to be, like, I remember that first night so vividly. I'm like staring up at my ceiling after that first day in bed in my apartment in Alexandria, Virginia, thinking, oh my God, I have to do this again tomorrow. And but I didn't quit, because I didn't think that was right. There was nothing I signed that said I had to stick around for longer than whatever. But I stuck around for a year. But that year was probably one of the hardest years of my life, because I'm now removed from everything that was familiar to me. Not only church, but my community back in Portland, my friends in school, relationship at the time. And so we were long distance. And it turns out, if you're miserable all the time and you're long distance, things tend not to work out, right?
That's true. That's true.
So that was my last real link to anything that was really familiar. And then when that relationship ended towards the end of that year, I was like, okay, you know what? Why am I here? What am I doing? Like, and so I moved back home, thinking, okay, I'm just going to take some time to just regroup and figure out what I want to do in life. But this was also the time of the recession. So so this is 2009 when I moved back, and I saw how much the economic situation was affecting my parents. Right, my parents ran dry cleaners. I mean, when people are low on disposable income, not really
Dry
dry
cleaning's the first to go.
Yeah. So, so while I was trying to pick up the pieces of my life, I saw the state of what my family was going through, and to their credit, they shielded me from all. They didn't want me to be involved. They're like, look, this is our problem.
Yeah.
Go live your life. You know,
Yeah.
do whatever you need to do.
Yeah.
And I think this is where the culture that I was embedded in start to influence my life in a lot more conscious way, which was that how can I, as the firstborn son, just turn a blind eye to this? Okay, let's say I do get a job somewhere, like elsewhere. Well, I got to make my own living, right? And what little leftover money am I going to just send that to them? Like, is that how I'm going to structure my life?
Yeah.
So I made the decision that, okay, well, while I'm picking up the pieces of my life, I'm going to stay here. I'm going to help out. And just to give some context, so they had taken out a lot of student loans, not just for me, but for my brother who was now in school too. And then of course their own, like the Parent Plus loans that they had taken out for our education. So my brother had his own loans. I had some, although it wasn't a lot for me. And they had, so I was at one point paying all 4 of those loans. And it was pretty much all the money that I was making at the time, you know, just going to this. And that was really hard. And I think that's part of the reason why I started to kind of, I guess withdraw is the right word, like withdraw from like church, from community, because I was getting a taste of how hard life actually is, right? At least the reality of what life is. I started getting really mad at, not maybe towards my parents a little bit, but like to the community as a whole, because I'm surrounded by all these older people. Nobody told me about things like, I don't know, how to manage your money, or how to make career plans. You know, all these things that I felt like were really necessary at this stage of my life, my early 20s, my mid 20s. And I think I started to really get resentful at my place in life at the time, which is why I really kind of just did away from all that I learned, or all that I thought I knew about being a Christian. I was like, forget it. I'm not going to go to church. I'm just going to, honestly, I don't have time to go to church. I'm working. I'm working all the time. And frankly, I was finding a lot more fulfillment in work than I was in just sitting in a pew listening to a sermon that I'm probably not going to remember the next day. So, but you know, when you have all of this knowledge of the Bible inside you, one of the things that always kept popping up in my mind was the story of Jesus in the desert, and how, you know, you have to master yourself before you go out and do greater things. Okay, not to say that I'm on that level, but I felt that always stuck with me during that time. The being in the desert, you know, and just going through the hardship and learning more about who you are, what you value. Do you really want to do this? Right? Do you really love your parents this much that you're going to keep doing this? And I stuck with it, and that was 7 years. I did not intend to be that. Believe me, I did not intend to be there for that long, but I was just grinding, and it really helped me to value my parents a lot more, because now I'm not seeing them as parents. I'm people, just people.
Yeah. You were doing some really key growing up in those years. You were becoming an adult.
A lot of adulting, during those years. And it was really necessary for me, because I think you know, as hard as I think my life was growing up, like, okay, yeah, I had a lot of things that my parents put on my plate, but really, did they, you know, I wasn't exposed to the outer world, like as much, right? I was, relatively speaking, I was pretty sheltered, right? So that those 20s, man, those were some of the best years of my life, but also the hardest, which two go hand in hand, really. And thankfully, by that almost exactly right at that 7-year mark was when I realized, you know what, I feel like I truly reconciled how I feel with towards my parents, and also with my own faith, that
Mm-hmm.
God isn't just up there. I just always use this analogy of up there versus he's down here, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He's in the small things. He's in there when you're doing the things that you don't want to do, but you have to do it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
That's a responsibility. Um, and thankfully the financial situation and everything is in a much better place now.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say the key takeaway was really that I was able to really understand my parents, and to love them in a way, they did their best.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
They had the tools that they had, you know, they tried to use them to their best, and to their credit,
Yep.
I thought they did it very well. Um, uh, not to say that there weren't times where I was like, this is too much, especially the corporal punishment part. That's a cultural difference.
But it's clear from your story that you very much figured out that your parents loved you.
Yeah.
And yeah, they had their own ideas, and their own ideas come from wherever they're getting ideas. But they were genuinely invested in your welfare and your best interest. However they construed it, this wasn't about them. They put themselves on the line for you and your siblings, and there was no doubt in anyone's mind. You might disagree about some of the particulars of the way they were thinking, but they loved you. And there are a few things that are better and more foundational than that for growing up. Because if your parents, they might have some cockamamie crazy ideas, they might be within a subculture, whatever it is, if you figure out they are for you and they are not in it for themselves, but they are for you, that goes a long, long ways in terms of the health then that you bring to the world. Because yes.
Yeah, as well. Right. Like, because that's well, yeah, so yes, that's all. And I feel like the true action that I took that made me really put my money more where my mouth is, in terms of like, I love my parents, they love me. I want to utilize this.
That's right.
When I was looking to get married, because I asked them, well, because for me at that point I knew, look, anybody that I marry, they're gonna have to gel with my family, and me with them too.
Yep.
I didn't want any kind of family drama or conflict between the in-laws. I had seen that with some of my peers, because when you're single for that long, you see all the other people getting married, right? And also hearing about how things are going, right? And from that, I realized the number one priority on my list was, I got to find somebody who fits well with my family. And so logically, I thought, well, if that's the case, then why gamble, try to find somebody, and then bring them to my parents? Why not? Why not reverse that? So I asked them if they knew anybody that they would recommend.
Okay.
And the first person on the list was
well, let's back up a little bit, because if we're thinking about this in the light of the conversations that I'm having with Rod and Eamon and Catherine, both of you are growing up in a conservative Christian subculture. You're also both growing up not only in a conservative Christian culture, but a conservative Christian subculture that, in one way or another, understands they understand church discipline, but they also understand community discipline. There are ways in your community to keep the youth in line. And please correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, because I have not explored this with Korean churches. I'm simply going with my assumptions, but traditional views about human sexuality from Christianity are intact. You're going to have sort of little, I'll call them enabling customs, whereby you're not really going to encourage young men and young women to sleep together before they're married. I mean, this is going to be, for the most part, the traditional Christian package in terms of the questions of sex and marriage. You wait for marriage, you plan for it. This is the package, and the whole community is not having a conversation about cohabitation and things like that. Nope, there's no conversation going on here. This is the way it is, and the community is going to through. Well, let me ask you this: what kinds of ways were there in the community to reinforce these practices in a, because if you're going to secular university, you're obviously seeing just how it's going out there in the American landscape. Now, I think partly because you come from an immigrant tradition, it's easier for immigrant groups to sort of be separate. And especially when there's a language difference, and especially when there's a visible ethnic difference. So, for the Dutch in America, Dutch can just kind of pass for Northern European white. And so, but of course, in the Christian Reformed Church history, that's a little different, because in a lot of ways, all of these immigrants that came over at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and all of those little immigrant churches are sort of passing through the culture at the same time. Now, you guys are in a very different wave of culture. All of your parents are, Isabel, were your parents immigrants too?
Yes.
Okay. All of your parents are immigrants. Your churches are separate. I mean, everything is pretty distinct. So that's going to impact your behavior when it comes to how do you go to public high school and secular university, and how do you live your life as a sexual being? And how does the church operate in that? And how does the family operate in that? It was funny, I was doing a conference, and there was a Hispanic contingent and a Korean contingent. And what the Hispanics said of the Koreans are, both we and the Koreans have hierarchies, but the Koreans live in them. We rebel all the time. So the Hispanic pastor said, and there's a degree of truth, because you very much have, I mean, anybody who's had even a degree of familiarity with Korean culture also understands that Koreans as family units, they pull together. I've seen that often. Parents will, I know Anglo parents that will not give their kids a dime for college. And that poor kid has to fill out the FAFSA. And if the parent has a lot of money, if they're not sharing, that poor kid's in trouble. But I've seen, and this isn't just true of Korean, often many Asian communities, they hang together, they work together, they pool resources. But again, in that strong container, you have forces going both ways. So I'd like to hear a little bit about being a Korean American in a secular context, given everything that's going on in terms of sex and dating in America when you're single.
Right. In 50 words or less, right?
We're doing all right on time.
Man, yeah, that is a big topic. I mean, I can't necessarily speak for Isabel, but
well, that's why she's here.
Yeah.
She can speak for herself.
How should I say this? Like this is where that's why I said before why it's very hard to see where Korean culture ends and Christianity begins for me in my life, because the two went in a lot of ways so hand in hand. Like you talked about the whole idea of hierarchies, like elders, and morality, right? Like the things fit very well. But yeah, sure, like growing up in the States, and by the way, this is also true in Korea too. Like, the modernization there is very much happening too, which is, I think, also affecting the marriage rates there as well. But I mean, I can just say for me growing up, like dating was a no-no. Like you prior to college, my sole focus was education. Now, we talk about personality traits. Like I'm actually pretty disagreeable. So like I dated, and
On the just basically not letting your parents know what you're doing.
oh, they knew. Like,
Oh,
there was no way they couldn't know. They weren't happy about it,
oh,
but that was my time of rebelling.
so you were a rebel. Okay.
in the high school, during my high school years. I mean, up until then, everything was fine. But at that point, I was like, look, like it's this kind of bleeds into when I talk about college and figuring out what the path that I want to take. Like right when I hit like 16, 17, I was like, come on, like how much more can I give? Especially when I got that acceptance to Dartmouth, I was like, all right, mom, dad, like I'm sorry, like you gotta lay off a little bit, so I dated in high school, and I also dated through college as well. And at that point, I think my parents were a little bit more understanding. They're like, okay, he's there, like maybe he's not going to marry any of these people, but like it's just let's just give him some space. And it also helps that I'm on a completely different coast, right? So
Yep.
there's monitoring that can happen. But yeah, certainly growing up, those separations, at least for me, were very much like you fell in line with it. And there was no doubt in my mind, by the way, like if I was younger, that if I did rebel and go outside those norms, like I'm out of the family, like, and I'm half joking with that, but I'm also half not, like
Yeah.
yeah, that's not a bridge that I'm going to cross, so it's only when I felt like I had built enough, let's say, capital within my parents' eyes, that I felt I could start bending the rules a little bit. But it's interesting, even though, like, I know you watch Korean dramas, right? And you've talked about them. Um, uh, Even now, right? Like, there's a show called Heart Signal. I don't know if you're
No.
it's a reality TV. It's sort of like it's a parallel to like Big Brother kind of, or there's a Japanese equivalent called I think Terrace House, where you just got a lot of single people in this place, and then you kind of watch them pair up or whatever. Um, in Heart Signal, the most you're going to get in terms of like anything sexual is maybe holding hands or maybe a kiss, but no skin is shown. Everything's very proper, and there are clear boundaries. You can see it. Versus, and then so we really liked that show. I thought it was really entertaining, and so I was like, oh, okay, here's a Japanese equivalent. Let's watch that. And it's like first episode, they're in bikinis, and they're swimming, and they're already getting pretty, that way.
Really?
So
That's
yeah,
interesting.
so even there's still that, while on the ground those rules are kind of being, not as enforced, the prevailing view, I would say, is still very much that sex is something that we're not approaching, we're not crossing that boundary,
Mm-hmm.
which is again why I felt like in the church it just felt so felt so hand in hand, like it was the same thing essentially.
Interesting.
What were your thoughts?
Yeah, it wasn't ever really talked about. And like you mentioned, Paul, it's just like, yeah, no sex before marriage. I think yeah, our personalities are very different. And so I think for me, as James is on the disagreeable side, I'm the agreeable. You couldn't tell, no. Yeah, just being a counselor and all that too.
Fits her
But
profession very well.
but I would say that it was a mix between fearing God and what my, culture and parents had kind of
Mhm.
it wasn't, I don't even really remember them ever saying explicitly no sex before marriage.
Right. You didn't have to say it.
You didn't have to say it. It was just no.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so I think those two forces definitely kind of I didn't rebel in that way.
Yep.
But I realized that there was still that desire to understand and to know these things. And so unfortunately, if church isn't providing it and your family isn't, then you look outside, and so it's like figuring out then, or reconciling what the world is telling me and what I feel like God is telling me. And so that was something that I had to, I think, figure out on my own more so. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
I was just thinking that you had asked, like, what are the social forces that are keeping this all together? And within a lot of what within Korean culture, there's definitely this idea of shame, right? And
Yes.
saving face.
Yep.
And when you're in a tight community, when you're sort of separate from the state at large, the city at large, you know a lot of people, you talk with a lot of people, you have you have strong bonds. If something happens, people hear about it. Like you just
Mhm.
know, right? And you're not supposed to. Well, not, I don't want to say you don't supposed to, but everybody kind of knows you don't want to be the one that sticks out, right?
Mm.
Because you're going to be the one that's going to be talked about, for better or worse, right?
Mhm.
Um, so certainly if one of us kids were like to rebel, and believe me, it's not like this was a perfect system. I mean, I was around a lot of kids. I mean, if you think I rebelled, like there is some, especially the boys, the much more disagreeable ones. I mean, there are some people that just totally turn their back on not even
Oh,
just
yeah.
church, but just family, like
Yeah.
in general, and just just fractures within the family of due to academic pressures or all this, all that stuff that wasn't just unique to my upbringing. But yeah, I mean, you heard about those, and
Yeah.
those are all the cautionary tales, and you just understand that you're not supposed to not you don't want to you're not supposed to do that, not just for your sake, but your parents are going to be the ones that are going to be talked about. Like, what did they do to bring about this outcome,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And uh, and again, is that all a bad thing? I I can't say that, because there's a lot of good things that come with that too. And I think those, depending on who you talk to in perhaps the second generation or later, about how they were raised and how that's not a good thing or whatever. Well, it's not as that black and white, right? It's there's a gray, right? And um yeah, yeah.
Now Isabel, when you went to Bible college, that was not a Korean school.
No,
No,
no.
I don't know of any all Korean Bible colleges in America.
Yeah, it was a small, pretty international, I would say, because
Okay.
there were students from like
Yep.
Japan and
Yep.
other, yeah, parts of the world.
Yeah.
So it wasn't only Korean.
My the Bible college I'm most familiar with, it's now called Kuiper College. Maybe it's Kuiper University, I don't know. It's in Grand Rapids. It used to be Reformed Bible Institute, then Reformed Bible College. And there are, for those of you who don't know, there are many Bible colleges kind of strewn throughout the United States. There's a whole movement of Bible colleges at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. But so Isabel, when you're at Bible college, you're still in a Christian container, But like you said, and this is often true of a lot of these Bible colleges, there's many international students, and it's also true of Bible colleges that people who, you might go to Calvin University or Wheaton and think, well, I'm going to go to this Christian college, but I'm going to be in pre-med and I'm going to go be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. But if you go to Bible college, you're learning the Bible. And the people who are going to Bible college, they're there for the Bible. I mean, there's no question about what they're all there for. And so then for you, then you're probably in the sort of the American evangelical container. And how was that in terms of coming from the Korean church? Because, I mean, a lot of people in America don't know some of the backstory of the evangelization of Korea at the beginning of the early 20th century. And so there's deep ties between American evangelicalism and the Korean church in many ways. Mm-hmm. And so what was it like for you going from a Korean immigrant community then to sort of the American evangelical world of the Bible college? And how did that go in terms of dating and marriage?
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of background, the Bible college I went to, one of the reasons why I was encouraged to go there was they have a good balance of the word and the spirit. I guess. And so, whereas I feel like if I had gone to Kansas City to IHOP, it would have been a lot of spirit. I'm not saying there isn't already there.
Right.
There's like different levels of that. And so I was really drawn to the spirit part of Bible college and that experience there, because I think that there were more different expressions of the faith, whereas in the Korean church, there were certain things, but you weren't as free to express in different ways. And so I really liked that about the Bible college experience in terms of like the faith aspect. Let's see. I didn't find it like so different, because even at my church, immigrant church, there was still like praying in tongues and that. And so it wasn't so different in that way, I'd say. But again, there was just more free expression in the Bible college setting. In terms of dating,
because Bible colleges can be kind of hot houses, because people are often going out into ministry and they don't want to go alone. So it's nice to wrap up the spouse at the Bible college level, because out you go together then.
Right. And there's that stereotype too there, where I'm sure, Paul, you might have heard, but the ring by spring, goal. And honestly, I didn't know about that while I was there. It was more of an after, like everybody talked about it, and I was like, oh. And I think it's because, my dating experience and in that realm of relationships, I think I wasn't really there to look for that. And so maybe my antennas for like seeing what other people were doing or like wasn't as like alert in that way. I did notice there definitely were those that paired up right away, and I do know people who married very young, just having met in Bible college, and then now they have like many children and all of that. But also that I wasn't as aware, I think, of that, of the dating and relationships in Bible college. But there really is that, I think, desire for, now that I'm like noticing, that ring by spring is true, and that there are many who enter in looking for spouses. That wasn't really something I was aware of then, but now looking back, I'm like, oh yeah, that was really there. And and I'd say some that I know of are very like successful and are still in the ministry and working together their marriages, but some didn't work out, and
yeah. So now let's go back to where I sort of interrupted you, James. Now, in terms of, so American culture is very individualistic, it's very consumeristic. And in terms of the marriage and dating scene right now, that individualism and that consumerism and that marketplace mentality is full on. And in many ways, a lot of the cultural elements that were still present, let's say in the 1980s when I was in college, a lot of those cultural elements are traditional cultural elements sort of passing away. And now we have apps, we have marketplace, we have all of these things. But yet, and this is something that's difficult for a lot of people to recognize, many immigrant communities have longstanding practice of far greater familial participation in finding mates for their children. I mean, you can't watch Fiddler on the Roof and not see matchmakers. Even on Netflix and a lot of streaming TV, you'll find shows of Indian, matchmakers. And I've seen some very interesting shows of, you've got these portfolios and so especially in the much more communitarian Asian cultures, family participation in matchmaking is a big deal because, as you articulated quite well, James, a very high priority is that this person fits well with my family. I'm not going to say that isn't important for sort of generic Americans, but I don't think it's at the level. I recently did a wedding for someone in our meetup. His father, he had some Japanese background in his family through his mother's side. His father was Anglo. He married the daughter of Vietnamese immigrants. And of course, in Vietnamese culture, it's not unusual then, see if I remember this right, for the bride has to live and in a sort of for the first year be kind of an indentured servant to the mother-in-law. And there are, in many of these different cultures, there are long-standing traditions. Now, in this particular case, in talking to the couple, one of the things was that the woman's father, when he immigrated into the United States, consciously chose not to live within the Vietnamese ghetto because he had daughters. He didn't want his daughters sort of living that Vietnamese life. He wanted his daughters to grow up American. And so with immigrant communities, you've got individuals who are making all those kinds of decisions too. You've got people who are perhaps less in agreeableness who say, I'm in this new country. Depending on their experience of the old country, let's say, I want my kids to grow up American, and so I want them to date American and yada, yada, yada. But now, the way, you approached me with this conversation, and the way you just briefly introduced it, you said, okay, if I'm going to look for a mate and I want this person to get along with my family, I'd like, it sounds like a fairly heavy level of parental involvement in terms of finding a mate. Now, is that traditional in Korean cultures?
Korean. There's Korean culture, there's Korean American culture, but I would say, definitely arranged marriages were a thing, like really strict, a lot more structured arranged marriages were a thing in the history of Korea. In modern times, it's more, I think, morphed into somebody recommends somebody, and they meet, they see if they're a good match, and then they decide, right? And I would say that is more in the vein of the approach that I took, which was this was not an arranged marriage by any means, but it was a lot more. I would say the impetus was a lot on my side to get my parents to be involved. I don't think my parents had no expectations that I would be asking them for who to marry. And if you had told me, 8, 9 years ago that I would be asking my parents, I would have probably vomited, like but again, through the process of growing up and again understanding myself more, and really wanting somebody who again meshed very well with my family and I with them as well, that I decided to take this route. And again, it might be uncommon in terms of a Western perspective, but this I would say is not necessarily uncommon. It might pique some interest, but it's like it's not uncommon, I would say, in the Asian culture or even the Korean culture at large. So like her brother often jokes to me that I might not be able to speak the language, Korean language, well, but I'm a lot more Korean in a lot of respects culturally. Because I do, again, and it's not just because it was indoctrinated within me. It's something that I really developed from within myself to really honor my parents in that way. So yeah, there was no question in my mind that I was going to start with, when I was really serious about wanting to get married, that I was going to start with my parents' recommendation, because that would smooth so much of the waters out in my mind. I should also note that I'm pretty high on neuroticism too. So
Interesting.
so I try to decrease the negatives in my life as much as possible.
Okay.
So you hear there's a stereotype of the mother-in-law or having just conflict with the in-laws, right? And I'd mentioned this in the email too. I was like, what? Why? Like, why just accept that as a fact of life? And because you asked before about the family involvement. Like, I just couldn't understand how having a kid with somebody isn't going to necessarily involve the parents. It's the grandchild of both sides,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So and I'm kind of getting on my own like soapbox here, but yeah.
Well, but it's a very interesting. So James, what's interesting about this is it is very Korean American, because your low in agreeableness, you're high in neuroticism. You approached this in sort of a self-actualizing kind of way. You didn't just fall into a cultural stereotype of arranged marriage or something like that. You initiated this and basically went to your parents and said, no, you're going to do this for me. I mean, that's kind of what it sounds like.
Yeah. And of course, my parents were thrilled when I did mention.
Yeah. Because I'll tell you, from the parents' point of view, a lot of it is, oh, I hope we like her or him. I hope they make a good choice, because watching your kid in a serious relationship with someone that you don't think, now that the parents aren't always right in that. Sure. And I know lots of stories where the parents are like, and then it turns out great. So parents aren't omniscient in this either, but no, you had your head on when you were thinking this thing through, and you went through it fairly rationally.
Well, yeah, I went in through it without. Honestly, I often mention to people that I went into it with a very clinically.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
Yeah, rationally, because look, I don't want drama. Like, I do not want any kind of drama between the two families. I would think of that sounds like hell on earth to me,
Okay.
And that's honestly one of the biggest reasons why I went that approach. Because why would I want to subjugate my future wife to that? Why would I put my parents through that, or their parents through that? And you don't think that's going to filter out to my brother, their brothers, like the whole, it just, let's just think about this rationally. and again, part of this, when we talk about the whole marriage crisis, and I don't want to talk, jump too far ahead, but I sort of think about, like, okay, if it is a crisis, then what are the things that we can say or do or give advice for, right? For people who are looking to find people. I can't say that this is a good strategy for everybody. I feel like it was a very personal decision on my part. Like you said, reconciling the attitudes with the culture that I was born in, and also the culture that I was surrounded by, and raised within that individualistic mindset. But I felt like the correct approach that was in line with those two was to, and again with my faith, was to honor your parents, not just in words, right, or in thought or in feeling, but really in action. And uh I mean, I got to tell you, I've never seen my parents so happy with her. As they like her more than me.
You know, I gotta bring some honesty into this conversation, knowing what a lot of people are going to be thinking out there. And they're gonna, okay, so I'm gonna say a few things now. Don't, you know, but just on a very surface level, people are gonna look at this video and say, well, of course he's happy. I
Okay.
mean, look at Isabel. I mean, she's beautiful. She's, you know, from everything we've seen in these videos, you know, and a lot of people are in the back of their mind thinking, I wouldn't trust my parents. You know, it's like, oh, but son, she's got a wonderful personality. You know, it's like, you know, I'm in my 20s. Yeah, personality, but yeah. So let's back up a little bit and say, well, how did your, I mean, did they go to type in KoreanWives.com? I was watching what movie yeah. I forget what I was watching, but it was Yes. It was the Jim Carrey movie Yes. And so he's saying yes to everything. And so got a pop-up ad from PersianWives.com. And he said, yes, we have this woman following him around all over. So how did your parents know about Isabel, and how did that happen?
Yeah, so my parents, again, having grown up, lived here in one place since the 80s, have they know every Korean. You know, okay. There's everybody. Not even just in here, but also like in Washington, because people move, and churches, as you know, like there's a lot of churches that do a lot of activities together. Yep. And so from that, and because of that, when her family eventually came to the church that we went to, because we actually
I didn't know your families were going to the same church
for a period of time.
Okay.
I didn't actually meet her until my parents introduced me to her, because I don't know, it's a source of jokes between us. It's like, how did our paths not meet? I mean, she went to a high school that is in the same district as, you know, those kinds of things. But I knew her younger brother, she knew my younger brother. But once but her parents then moved to the Seattle area.
Okay.
I went to college. So once she was there, there was no, and when I was here, then after graduating from college, we were in separate states. But my mom always, I guess, had kept her in mind.
Mothers.
Yeah. Funny little story. Like in 2013-14, she came down to visit the church that we're at. And it was a New Year's service. It's midnight. As we're all filing out of the church, my mom like drags me over and says, "Talk to this girl." And so she's there, right? And I'm like, okay, well, I'm pretty sure I know why my mom wants me to talk with you. And that was the extent of the conversation. Like, because it was so busy, she was on the way out, leaving and whatever. The funny part is she doesn't remember this at all. So I remember how we first met, but she actually doesn't remember how we met. So it wasn't until
didn't make a big impression there, James. That's what you're saying.
Yep, exactly. I was not somebody that at that point.
Now I want to hear this whole thing from Isabel's side.
Sure.
Because it's okay, rational James here, decides to approach it this way, but usually the ladies like a little romance. I don't know, maybe Isabel, you're there, you're team rational too. Tell me about it.
No, I don't think I'm team rational. Whenever James explains it like that, there's a part of me that's like, man, was that a clinical decision? Like, I don't like that.
Exactly.
Which I say absolutely.
But I understand his like intent, and that the way it played out wasn't super clinical in that at the time. So I say that I don't have as much of a clinical approach in this, where I did not consult with my parents, asking them for their suggestions. I definitely talked with them, but there wasn't anyone that I talked with them to that level. So yeah, I would say that
the arrangement was more from my side to this
yeah. And
so she was living in Seattle at
Yeah.
the time. I when my mom suggested that I reach out, or said like, look, this is in not as many words, she was basically like, this is my first choice. so I found her on Facebook. I friended her, we messaged, and then,
what did you say about this? Because, hi, my mom says you're her first choice for a mate for me. I want to
didn't
know
say
the
that.
pickup line here.
I think if that was his pickup line, I
yeah.
declined friend.
So look, it might have been clinical, but I'm no idiot, right? Like I tried to find some sort of connection that lended itself to some degree of familiarity between us. So I said, hey, I'm so and so's brother, and I actually know your brother, and it's nice to meet you. that was my way in of trying to create some kind of connection first. And then I'll let you take it away from there.
Yeah, and I was in that phase of my life. I was pretty content with being single. It was a couple years before then where I was very interested in dating and seeing what that world was like, because I hadn't done much of it, contrary to James. And so that, yeah, I was pretty content, and I was just trying to focus on what I was doing at the time, thinking of going into grad school. So I met James around the time I was going to start grad school for counseling. And James had some good things going for him, in that he's a great conversationalist, and that is something very attractive to me. And from his conversations, I could see that he was a person of depth, and that then continued those interactions, and the rest is history.
So let's be clear on a few things here. James' mom points him in the right direction.
Yes.
But James has to land the plane here. I mean, James has to, there's no, your family wasn't at the other side saying, well, there's James. I mean, so you had to, so in that way, it is a very, it is a very American courtship and relationship, because, okay, so here she is, friend her on Facebook, start talking, see if we can kindle this thing from, acquaintance to friendship to romance to all the way to spouse.
Yeah. What really he landed the plane very well, in that I realized from early on that he was a man of action. So it wasn't just prolonging the talk, and we would just talk and email, and that was it. But while I was working in Seattle at that time, I was both going to school and working part-time as a server at a restaurant. And he came to visit me. So he drove from Portland to visit me while I was working. And so that was my first like in person, well, the one that I could remember interaction. Yeah. And it was really what is it, like memorable for me because he had taken that initiative to come and visit me, and yeah.
Yeah,
I
and
like that.
when she says like action, that really was the key thing, which was like, look, if I realized in talking with her, and a lot of these conversations we're kind of sussing out, are we good fit? Are we a good fit for each other? If that wasn't the case, then let's not waste each other's time. It's time to move on, right? But when I realized that it was gonna, this had legs and it was gonna go somewhere, and I'd met her and actually went on like actual dates. You know, I would drive up to Seattle and, you know, we did a lot of day trips during those 2 years. She was in school. Within the first month of really getting to know her, I was like, all right, we're gonna get married. Like, yeah. So
Mr. Rational.
yeah, yeah.
But you, hey, you were very rational. You're very smart in this, and you showed her you were serious and interested, and so no, good for you. Good for you.
Well,
That's really a great story.
yeah, yeah. And the rational side of it also, it isn't just, again, because I was just naturally that way or anything. Having dated before, I understood how much emotions can muddy the waters, you know, and how much that can make you want to, you know, take actions that might not be in your best interest. So you know, and through my 20s and, you know, the process of maturing and growing up, but also, you know, in just doing a lot of this work and helping out my parents, emotions in some sense, I don't want to say I like threw them out the window, but they're a signal to something, right? But
Yeah, you got to be a little careful here with this part.
yeah.
Honey, I made a checklist.
Yeah.
I did the sums. You added up.
Yeah.
There
Yeah.
you go. You're the
But
product of an equation.
yeah, yeah. But I took a lot of those lessons with me, which is that emotions for me are secondary. Like,
Okay.
again, it's not to say that there's not a time and place for them. Believe me, I'm no robot. But I just, when it comes to a serious decision, I mean, it's a serious decision.
Yeah, it is.
And
It's a
again,
huge decision.
right, probably the most important decision you'll ever make. And let's, faced with that level of decision, let's go into it with your eyes open.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where a lot of that, the Peterson type of videos and all those things, those messages, were really borrow about, like, you know, like, go into things with your eyes open. Right. And so I went in with my, and so did she. I mean, honestly, I would say that those dating years, not just because of the fact that we're a long distance, but she was grilling me about my faith.
Well, she's studying counseling.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah. Right.
she's armed with all this knowledge now. So tell me about this.
Right. So we had a lot of conversations where I'm just like, just spilling my guts about who I am and what I believe. And I honestly think that dating was a lot harder than marriage. Like, it was, I mean, we also obviously had a lot of good times, but when you're long distance, the only thing you can do most of the time is talk.
Yeah. How old were both of you when you married then?
I was 30 years
30,
old.
yeah, and 32, 33. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So now that's a key factor in the story too. Neither of you are children at this point.
Oh, no, yeah, no.
Both of you had you did plenty of school, you've lived as adults, you've taken care of yourself. So yeah, you're you're in that sense, you're not a couple of early 20 somethings. I mean, when I was married, I had just turned 25 and my wife was about to turn 22. So, I mean, compared to you two, I mean, we were kids. And
sure.
You know, we had met at my Christian college, and I think my parents were just happy that when my sister was spying on us, so my sister was letting my parents know that I was interested in someone, and yada yada yada. So, but that's sort of an American way of keeping the parents at arm's length, so they don't They don't get too involved and muck anything up here. But
Right.
I had great parents too. I'm not saying anything about my parents in that, but
Sure.
Okay. We've had a couple videos about the marriage crisis. I know you guys have watched them. What are some of your thoughts?
Yeah. I'll say that my first thought is why this series of yours has really intrigued me is because being married now, marriage is something that I'm contending with and trying to navigate on a daily basis. And so in some sense, when you're having these conversations with people who are married or were divorced or single or but are in the mindset of relationships, it really helps to form my own view of things. And and so I don't know if I have any necessarily thoughts on the crisis. I do understand, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I've heard, how you articulated, it's that marriage rates are declining. The church isn't really doing much to.
I think many churches just don't know what the heck to do.
Right.
I think they're looking at this like, we have no idea what to do. We have lost. I mean, you guys come from a fairly thick culture that was able to one degree or another enforce rules and expectations on community, and that sort of funnels you into, and then both of you sort of adapted to your subculture and then the broader culture and approached it, and bang, you in that sense solved the marriage crisis riddle for yourselves, and at this point seem pretty happy about the way you approached it.
Yeah.
I think that, like, just being a counselor as well, just seeing the need, where I feel like churches can be the best place to be able to have more of these conversations and resources. And that's where I am right now, where I'm still learning as a counselor just in the field, but eventually I would love to have the church be this resource and this community where people can come together and share about like marriage hardships or and have that conversation and communication. Topics like, even like you mentioned, like sex and marriage and divorce, even just all of these different topics. I would really like to see that. And Paul, like you were saying, right now churches want to be that kind of resource, but aren't really sure where to start or what to do. And so I do feel hopeful that churches will start doing that and becoming that place. So yeah.
I think churches, there's, for those who aren't familiar, American evangelicalism has voluminous resources on all of these topics from an evangelical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the difficulty that churches are having is that the context has changed so quickly, and the norms have changed so quickly, and Eamon said, Carl Truman, his church history prof, said, to one degree or another, when the automobile was invented, church discipline went out the window. And having grown up in sort of the waning years of a semi-thick cultural container that was the Christian Reformed Church. The Christian Reformed Church, along with many immigrant churches, at some point have to figure out how to deal with the assimilation question. I was my last trip down to Southern California for a classis meeting. It was actually Classis Greater Los Angeles. It wasn't one of the Korean classes, because all 4 Southern California classes have significant Korean church populations. visited, the classes was being held in a Korean church, and to walk onto that campus, you would assume this was just sort of a Southern California mega church. That's the way it looked like. And so on one hand, Koreans in America have been quite successful, and in a lot of ways have managed to, in some ways, pick up some of these American megachurch things, but you scratch a little bit on the surface and very quickly, oh yeah, this is a Korean church. You could tell just by, once you've been in a number of Korean churches, you look around as, oh, this is a very Korean church. Someone driving by would like, oh, that's an American megachurch. Korean. So with all of the, I'd say, disruption that's been happening via technology, I think the church is really struggling to figure out what to say beyond its old message, which has been no sex before marriage, and then churches. I mean, a lot of people don't recognize that the divorce statistics among people say, well, Christians divorce at the same rate as non-Christians. No, not exactly. Pretty more in-depth studies have shown that Christians who take their faith very seriously, who actually participate in church, Christians that are like that, rather than just saying, I believe in God and I'm a Christian, although I don't really go to church. Christians who very deeply participate in church don't divorce at anywhere near the rate of others, partly because churches do help and churches do have resources. But yet, one of the things happening in the Christian Reformed Church right now, and in many other denominations, is churches are grappling with all of the ways that the continuing evolution of the sexual revolution impacts the culture and then impacts individual lives. Both of you, by the time you found each other, already had solid Christian commitments, solid commitments to sort of the package of traditional Christian marriage. And so obviously finding each other where you had some deep agreements there and lots of other commonalities and similarities in terms of your upbringing, really solid start to getting going.
Yeah. It's, I think it's I don't think it's any coincidence that you're talking about the marriage crisis on sort of through this, while also talking about all the things that Jordan Peterson is doing. And the reason why Jordan Peterson has rocketed in popularity is, well, initially was because of his message that was geared towards young men. And I feel like a lot of what perhaps can be done for marriage as a whole is building up the man and building up young men. I hesitate to bring this up just because but I know you've commented on him before, but you remember Kevin Samuels?
Yeah.
I'm always interested in seeing people who rocket up in popularity because they're clear, and especially among men, because they're clearly tapping into something, right? That's there. And he often, a lot of what he talked about, and I don't agree with a lot of things and the way he says a lot of the things that he says, but a lot of his message was about giving a lot more structure to men, and how, and then like giving them sort of like an order of operations of, this is what you should be doing while you're young as a man. He talked a lot more, especially on the financial side of things, and that is certainly one part of this larger story that I feel like just again isn't really talked about in perhaps the church setting, about like, I mean, look, if there's any place for the red pill to be, I feel like it should be within the church, right? To tell the truth about to go beneath the layer of what relationships and romance ought to be or should look like, but really getting to the nitty gritty of what they are, right? And going into it again with your eyes open, and I guess, I don't know, maximizing your chances of getting married and being in a successful relationship. And one of the things I really liked about him was how much he espoused the idea of counseling, for, you got to heal from these wounds that you have, because you're going to bring it into whatever relationship you're in, right? So again, I hesitate to bring him up just because he's very,
I
a lot of things, but
he was fascinating. He was I mean, because my story, I grew up much more within the African American community. And these conversations in the African American community, wow, they're a huge deal. They're a huge deal. And that's, I think though, I mean, part of what we're wrestling with is, just as in your story, within a religious sub-community, I mean, we talked about the fact you didn't even have to tell kids don't have sex before marriage. Everybody knew. I mean, there's so much sort of absorbed norms, sometimes wisdom that's in the community, that some of this stuff can be a real benefit. But like you also said about Kevin Samuels, part of what's going on is that the world is getting just so incredibly complex that, let's say if, 75 years ago, well, okay, go to college, get a good job at a good corporation, show up to work, be a good employee, work for them until you get your gold watch, and then you're going to get your insurance benefits, and then you're going to get your retirement benefits, and everything will be fine. Now it's really difficult to people need wisdom, and figuring out how to get the wisdom they need is not an easy thing. And again, part of what I had growing up in the 60s and 70s, and then college in the 80s, and what you had was religion, and your religious community were a conveyor of historical wisdom that, at least to one degree or another, put you in a good track. That, yeah, there's going to be issues with it. We can talk about all the issues with conservative religious communities, but it worked for you guys. It worked for me. It might work for, a good percentage of the people. It doesn't work for 100%, but now the disruption coming in, it's chaotic. And I mean, part of what this whole corner of the internet and Jordan Peterson have all been about is, okay, people are, even though, Isabel, you grew up in a broken home, it sounds like the repairs that were done on your home of origin were done fairly well, and you benefited from them.
Yeah. Just definitely through God, and just my relationship with God, but also a large part of it was meeting my husband, James.
Yep.
That journey has definitely mended many wounds.
Yes. And I regularly meet with people who have not been so fortunate. And as a counselor, I mean, in some ways, the refugees of the disruption and wreckage of marriage, they're your bread and butter. I mean, you go right back to those family of origin questions, and I regularly sit down with people, and people are, why do you do what you do on your randos conversation? It's because I've been a pastor for all these years, and when I start conversations with people, it's not, I'm borrowing some of this from psychology, but I'm not doing Freudian analysis here. I just want to hear your story. And if you're going to tell me that dad drank too much and mom was angry and controlling, and they split up when you were 10, and mom's boyfriend or dad's new girlfriend or stepmother, or and then this school and moving around, and you don't have to hear too many of those stories to begin to have an understanding of how these issues are then going to be propagated into this person's relationships and their ability to attach, and off we go. So
yeah, and I don't want to talk too much about the divorce aspect of her upbringing, but I do see from my side of things, because my parents are still together, have always been, not, which doesn't say that their marriage was smooth sailing by any means, but they were together. And in some ways, when we do, it's sort of like you bring certain assumptions into life, right, based off of your family of origin. And no matter how frustrated or angry I got at my parents, I always knew that they, as a unit, like, had my back.
Yep.
Right? And I'm very lucky for that. And it's something that I've only now recently, gotten to really value. And it's that much more because sometimes when I view Isabel, because that wasn't there, it's sort of like there's this wound, or there's this gap that is continually trying to resolve itself. I mean, it's very much in a very good place now. But when we were dating, in some ways, I feel like a lot of the questions and a lot of the sussing out on my part was like, are you really the person that's gonna stick around?
Yeah.
And again, I understand that now more, being in marriage with her, because yeah, it's just very interesting to see that, because this foundation that I have, that I feel like, in terms of my parents' love for me, is just, it's been so well formed. It's almost like I sometimes wish my parents just like left me alone than anything. Like, I had too much of it, but now seeing it within the marriage context, it's like the attention that they give to her, which I find, like, just as like echoes of them being overbearing just from my childhood, is almost, it's like so healing for her, because she didn't have it.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it just gives me a lot more appreciation, I guess, for how powerful divorce is in someone's life, and yeah.
Yeah, I should really have Andrew Root on to talk about that, because that like in the 70s, when no fault divorce sort of became the law of the land, sort of unleashed a lot of divorces. And then the word out there was, oh, the kids will be all right. And then by the late 80s, early 90s, longitudinal studies were saying, well, maybe they're not quite as all right as we thought they were. And so it's yeah, life is hard. There's a lot of challenges, and the difficult thing, when I talk to couples who are splitting up or considering splitting up, the difficult thing is that the kids didn't ask for this dissolution. I mean, it's not their fault, and you're about to hand that child a burden that that they will bear. And again, God can take burdens and turn them into blessings, but generally speaking, in terms of your kids, you want to give them as many blessings as you can and as few burdens as you can. That's just what being a good parent is. So
Right. Can I ask you one question with this series of the marriage crisis? What do you hope to do with the series?
So Rod, who's on the series, was a big impetus in this, because I met him before he was married again the second time, and he he saw very early on. I mean, we had a connection through the town my mother's from and through his family's from, and he heard that connection right away. I came up very early on, and so then we started talking. We've talked offline quite a bit over the last 4 years. But I could see he unlike me had a real he had done a lot of learning as a divorced man dating over decades. And he very clearly saw, and I think he's right, that culturally we are heading towards a moment when we are going to have a lot of women in their and a lot of women, especially because men, like Rod, he mentioned this in the last video. He and his wife are hoping that they'll be able to have a child together. But there's going to be a lot of women who have sort of bought a package in their 20s that they might have some real regrets about in their 50s. And culturally, we're sort of setting up women for this difficulty because okay, so you're in college, you're in high school until you're 18, and then you get your undergraduate degree by 22. Then if you're really going to be successful, you're going to spend 2-3 more years in college, and then you've done all of that work to get this graduate degree in this profession, now you're going to spend 2-3-4-5 years in that profession, and before you know it, you're in your mid-30s. And did you settle down with a man? I mean, you could attract men's attention in the 20s, and if you wanted sex and dating and romance, maybe you were able to get that into your life, but you didn't. And so he saw out there in the dating marketplace what was happening, and he was also seeing that increasingly men and women were having a harder time understanding each other, that the conversation was going in two different directions. And now we sort of have it where feminism is going one way and MGTOW red pills are going another way. And it's like, one side is saying marriage is a patriarchal oppression, and the other side is saying women are going to steal your money if you marry them. Just, stay out there in the marketplace and get your sexual needs met and keep your money to yourself. It's like, this isn't a good recipe for all of us going into the future, because what you're going to have is you're going to have a whole lot of kids, and the numbers on those kids going into the future, they're more and more, and it's looking worse and worse. Getting that good foundation is really helpful in becoming a happy, healthy, productive adult. So civilizationally, it's a problem. And so I don't know that, we're gonna land the plane with answers and deliverables to people, but I'm hoping that along the way we'll be able to, for me, a lot of it is like we've done today. Why spend 2 hours going through the story of one particular Korean American Christian couple? How big of a population in America is that, and how many of them watch my channel? Not a lot.
Yeah.
But people will glean from your story wisdom, and they will, I just had a conversation earlier this morning with a guy who said basically, to aspire is to in some ways want to imitate. There's that mimetic sense. And I'm hoping that listening to this story, and it's really nice that there's the both of you on it, because my channel is watched. I look at the Google Analytics of those who log in. It's 90% men watching my channel, 10% women. So, but I think telling your story, people are going to glean from your story wisdom, and that hopefully should help them from wherever they're at. They might be that they're a young man and they're single and they're saying, shoot, that James kind of had a good idea and it worked for him. Maybe I'll give it a try, and maybe it will work, maybe it won't work, but it might put them on a road of action that will bring them someplace better. And, at the heart, that's a lot of what the whole Peterson revolution was about. Don't just watch, do and try And if you fail, brush yourself off, think about it a little bit, go at it again, get going after it. And maybe this will help.
Well, I hope so. And for me personally, like, I don't know if we have what we have necessarily to offer, but I'm certainly wanting to learn, of more about marriage and yeah, all of it, because I want this to work, and it's work, so
Yeah, it is work. And you guys are just getting started.
yeah.
No kids yet? Do you have any kids yet?
Yeah, so we are actively trying.
Okay.
Is it okay to talk
Yeah.
about this summer? We found out we were pregnant in May, but at our first OBGYN appointment, we found out that it was not viable. It was a miscarriage.
Yes.
And so yeah, it was a pretty rough summer for us, because it would have been the first grandchild for both sides. But yeah, we are actively trying, and hopefully in the near future, and it'll happen. And yeah, like that moment was was it in some that my view in that was, this is marriage, like helping her through this process of grief. And I was grieving too, but look, I'm the guy, like I have to hold down the fort here, right? And that really taught me what marriage is. It's not all Instagram posts and trips to places. It's like it's calling our parents crying because we don't know what to do, and just looking at each other and just trying to figure out where to go from here. So yeah, but hopefully in the near future we'll be.
Well, I'm sure I will join many people who watch this video and pray for God's blessing that you two will have a lovely family, because it is a blessing from God, and it always has been. So
that Paul has 5 kids. Yeah.
Well, like I said, we got married young. and we didn't we had our first child in 91, and then we didn't have another one for 3.5 years after that, and we weren't trying to really prevent much of anything either. So it's and what was funny though was, after we had the second one, then they started coming, and it's like my wife's body was like, oh, I know how to do this. And then the operation started. So then by 5 rolls around, it's like, I don't know, my wife loves kids, and I'm like, oh, they're small now, but they're going to get real expensive when they get to be college age. So that's true.
Right.
So
your oldest married, or
my oldest is not married. No, none of my kids are married right now. I'm I don't. My kids don't like me talking. I mean, they learn that as a preacher, because if you start using your kids as sermon illustrations all the time, kids are sitting there like, I didn't volunteer to be a sermon illustration, so I'm not going to volunteer them to be YouTube illustrations either. So, well, any last things?
I don't think so. I mean, I hope to come down to Sacramento. I mean, how close is that to Stockton?
Oh, we're about 45 minutes north of Stockton.
Okay.
So
yeah, I had a cousin who used to live in Stockton. She passed away, and she's buried, I believe, somewhere in the Stockton area. So I would like to go there and pay her a visit. And if it's on a weekend, I'd love to come to.
Oh, that'd be wonderful. So, well, thank you both. This has been absolutely delightful hearing your story and getting to meet you both. And and I do hope that I just think that others will be blessed through this. So thank you.
And thank you for your time and all you're doing in this YouTube space. And yeah, it's really awesome. And thanks for all the content.
Well, my pleasure. My pleasure. All right. Take care.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.